You should not have tried that. You are way too late to be pushing like that. God, these things are so deadly. Oh, hello. Can I fire through this? I don't think I can break that down. I can't kill him unless I actually move out there, and I don't want to do that this early. Right, if I can carve the missile right... Oh, can you fucking get out of the way, please? I can kill him, you can't. Fucking move! Alright, he's smoked up. There's no one else over here, I don't think. Let's go out and do this. If I can just, like, get enough of an angle... I don't think I can do it. It's too shallow of a curve. I could do it if I managed to get lucky. There we go. Okay, we got him. Go for that. If the Abrams had killed him, I would have been very upset. Oh, shit. Oh, no! Oh, no! Oh, dear. Okay, well, you're not gonna... Thank you. That was the T-80. The Abrams didn't even see him. Abrams is f***ing useless. Jesus Christ. Is he gonna repair us now? Are you gonna... Thank you, dude. That... So you've got the red enemies, you got the blue enemies, right? I did make it into the cap anyway. What a freaking potato. Alright, let's go. Thank you for the repair, dude. Just leave me sitting there. Oh, dear. Oh, no. I was gonna pull up and repair him. I'm not that much of a dick, but... Oh, well. I was more used to the team dead anyway. Right. That scared the shit out of me. In the last video, we went through a massive list of potential wheeled IFVs and modern era scout cars that could be added to War Thunder, specifically looking at NATO nations. Personally, I find these types of vehicles really enjoyable to play, and apparently many of you guys do as well. They also present a really great way to introduce more domestically developed vehicles to nations like Italy or Israel, and in this case China. Russia also don't have any of these types of vehicles currently, so in this video that's exactly what we're going to go over. Again, we're looking specifically at IFV types, equipped primarily with autocannons and some anti-tank missiles, alongside a couple of dedicated ATGM carriers. We're not going to be looking at wheeled vehicles with tank-sized cannons like the Type 11 though, despite there being definitely a couple more options, and Russia being one of the only nations to still lack one. Nor are we going to be talking about wheeled artillery or MLRS vehicles. We'd be here all day. There are probably more of these vehicles that could be added in the top tiers than tanks. If you hadn't seen part 1, it'll be linked down below in the description and on screen, so definitely go check it out. Now before we get started, I have two things. Firstly, I missed out the French VBCI in the last video, which was my mistake. In my hurry to get that massive list of vehicles together and get the video out, I skimmed over this one, and for some reason I thought this vehicle was only equipped with the Rheinmetall 20mm. Now outside a couple of little 4x4s like the R3T20 or the VBL I mentioned briefly last time, vehicles that function as little SPAAs and passive scouts, I don't think vehicles with only a 20mm can really be added. It's just not a powerful enough gun. Even the Weasel 1A2 kinda seems out of place, fighting against Shermans with second generation thermal sights. And I think the Kurtz would have been a better pick, but it is primarily an SPAA either way. A larger IFV or an 8-wheeled IFV, which tend to be quite big platforms, aren't going to be able to function very well in the same role in game. That means your spare Panzer Lukes, your AMX-10s, I think a lot of you were surprised not to see the Lukes in the last video, and this is why. The VBCI though is actually equipped with a 25mm, very similar to the Freccia's gun with the same ammunition and rate of fire. It was first built in the early 2000s and entered service in 2008, and like all the 8-wheeled IFVs, it has 100 km/h top speed. It has a thermal sight, and this one can be fitted with the same soft kill active protection system as the AMX-30 Brennus, but this is pretty inconsequential, so I think an 8.7 BR alongside the Freccia makes sense. Then there's also a variant with a 30mm Mark 44 Bushmaster gun which would fit at 9.0, so that France has a 9.0 30mm wheeled IFV just like pretty much every other nation. Also, I should mention, for some reason in the last video I made it sound like Sweden used the LAV-25, which they don't. I don't know why I said that. I was probably talking about a variant of the Moag Piranha, and then had a whole section in my script talking about how the LAV-25 was based on the Piranha, and then the Piranha ended up being upgraded in the exact same way and used by a buttload of nations, and that even though Sweden don't use a cannon-armed variant to my knowledge, that might be close enough for the Swiss variant to go to Sweden, and then didn't like that for the video and just deleted that whole section from the script to save time, but then forgot to delete the first sentence because I'm a potato. Whatever. Sweden doesn't use the lav-25. The other thing before we get started is that we have a bunch of new merch out in the armory, some new mugs and drink bottles with these cool War Thunder based designs, so if you want to support the channel, get some cool channel merch, go check out the armory, link below. I'm in crippling debt. Alrighty guys, let's jump into it and see what the Eastern Bloc has to offer. Now, Russia is definitely the nation with the most of these types of vehicles, which makes it seem strange to me that they haven't received any in-game yet. The first two on this list are the 9P122 Malyutka and 9P148 Konkurs. These are BRDM-2 armoured cars fitted with those ATGMs, which are the stock and spaded missiles on the BMP-1, and they entered service in the 60s and 70s respectively. The Malyutka has 6 missiles ready to fire, with 14 spare, while the Konkurs only has 5 ready. They both have top speeds of 100 km per hour and power to weight ratios of 18 horsepower per ton. The Konkurs could also be given thermals, as it received them in the late 90s. I'd give them battle ratings of 7.3 and 8.0, matching the British Swingfire and Striker. The Malyutka obviously has some downsides compared to the Swingfire, being that its missiles are manually controlled rather than semi-automatic, but it also has plenty of benefits that I think make up for that, like being able to fire directly forward and having that multi-shot capability. It matters more than you'd think. Moving on, we have the BTR-80A and the BTR-82A, which are probably the main ones you were expecting from this video. The BTR-80 is Russia's LAV. That's the easiest way I can describe it. It entered service around the same time and for the same role, but unlike the US, the Soviet Union had a history of these kinds of vehicles, with the BTR-60 and 70 dating all the way back to the 1950s. They're virtually the same in mobility and protection as the LAV, but they differ in two important ways. The BTR-80A equips the 2A72 30mm autocannon from the BMP-3, which is a lightened version of the BMP-2's gun, and it's housed in an unmanned turret, something rather impressive for the Soviet Union. On the other hand, the BTR-80A lacks a thermal sight, something made up for by the later BTR-82A. I don't believe either could use the new 30mm APFSDS rounds recently given to the BMP-2M, meaning they'd have the same penetration as the LAV-25. But on the other hand, the 30mm has a much higher rate of fire and does better damage, making it much more effective, particularly for killing other light vehicles at close ranges, or destroying cannon barrels. With this in mind, I think putting the BTR-80A at 8.3 alongside the LAV and RCV is perfectly fine, while the 82A could come in at 8.7 alongside the Freccia. Either could potentially be made a premium, and personally I'd prefer the 82 to be the premium so that free-to-play players still get the vehicle type in their 8.3 lineups. Otherwise, you could just folder them both in the tech tray. The only issue I see here is that with the BTR-82A being so heavily used by Russian forces in Ukraine, it might be a bad look for Gaijin to add it to War Thunder right now. Though they're perfectly happy celebrating the PLA day, so perhaps they wouldn't see it as an issue. There goes my social credit score, I guess. Next is the BTR-90, which is basically just an improved version of the previous two vehicles. It has a much better power to weight ratio, given an engine almost twice as powerful, and it entered service in the mid-2000s. Rather than the unmanned turret, the BTR-90 has literally just the BMP-2 turret slapped onto the 8-wheeled chassis. That means not only the better 30mm gun with a variable rate of fire which could use the APFSDS, but it also means Konkurs ATGMs. I don't believe it could mount the upgraded Konkurs M missile with a tandem warhead though, as these required new rails, but like the BTR-82 it would get thermals. As for barrel rating, it'd have to be either 9.0 or 9.3. I think 9.0 would be okay given that its gun has less pen than the ICVD or Boxer Lance, but 9.3 would be better given that it has ATGMs. At least if the BMP-2M wasn't already there with Cornets. Now the BMP-2M just moved from 8.7 to 9.3, but that definitely wasn't enough. Move it up to either 9.7 or even 10.0, and the BTR-90 can slot in nicely at 9.3. I also wanted to talk about a potential event vehicle, the Serbian Lazar 3. There isn't a whole lot to say on the vehicle itself, it's basically a heavier BTR coming in at almost 30 tons, and it uses the 2A42 autocannon in a remote turret with thermal optics. It was designed in 2015 and is only now entering service, and its performance is obviously very similar to the rest. The controversial bit, I think, is going to be whether Serbian vehicles belong in the Russian tech tree, and given the war in Ukraine, adding other European nations to Russia in War Thunder could be seen as Gaijin being pro-Russian. Apparently, Gaijin planned to add some Ukrainian vehicles like the Oplot or BTR-4 to the Russian tree before the war started, but they'd be slammed for doing that now, as it'd basically be like saying, according to us, Ukraine belongs to Russia. Wouldn't be popular. Serbia, I think, is fair game though. They're definitely closely allied with both Russia and Belarus, who in turn is Russia's most avid supporter in this conflict. Serbia uses mostly Russian military tech, and during 2022, they've continued to purchase it. They've also taken a mostly neutral stance on the war, leaning more towards support of Russia. It's all a bit political for me to want to go into detail in a War Thunder video, but the TLDR is that I think the Serbian Lazar 3 could be a great Russian event vehicle, and politics aside, the turret is Russian made anyway. It would most probably be able to use the APFSDS rounds, so battle rating would be 9.0, along with things like the ICVD or Boxer we mentioned last time. The last 8-wheeled IFV for Russia is the VPK-7829 Bumerang. The Bumerang is the replacement for the BTR-80 and 90, though it hasn't yet entered mass production or service. But when has that ever stopped Gaijin? Outside the Armata platform, this is about the most advanced vehicle Russia have ever produced, and it only began development in 2011. The variant we're looking at has the same weapon systems as the BMP-2M, the 30mm 2A42 and 4 Kornet ATGMs, but in a remotely operated turret. It is exceedingly heavy for this type of vehicle at 34 tons, but apparently is still amphibious. X to doubt, Russia. Anyway, I think it would fit at a battle rating of 10.0 or 10.3. Wherever the BMP-2M moves, this should be like one spot above it. There's also a variant of the BTR-90 with the same Berezok turret as the BMP-2M, which could fit at 10.0, possibly as a premium, and perhaps even tied to the BTR-82A, the same way the F-89D is tied to the F-89B, since both the BTR-82 and BTR-90 Berezok were designed as stopgaps. Oh, and I cannot go without mentioning the BTR-90M from 2001, which has the turret from the BMD-4. The BMD-4 should definitely be 9.0 already, as it's far superior to the BMP-3, so I think the BTR-90M would fit in at 9.3. I don't really think Gaijin needs to add all of these though, and since they want to add the BMD-4M anyway, I think the BTR-90M is probably unnecessary. The BMP-2M is already a squadron vehicle, the Lazar 3 is a better event reward, the BMD-4 with the same turret was already an event reward, and the BMD-4M is already coming to the tech tree, so the BTR-90M serves no real purpose. Maybe a battle pass reward? It's like the only one we're still missing. It also failed to enter serial production, which doesn't really matter to Gaijin, but it's just another nail in the coffin. And I mean, if that weren't enough, damn she ugly! And the last 3 Russian vehicles are 4x4 armoured cars, my favourite. When it comes to the performance of these kinds of vehicles, think Type 93, but able to attack ground targets. Personally, that's something I'd give my left nut for. Not only would they make for extremely effective scouts and camping vehicles, but they also introduce a wee bit of a sense of derpiness and craziness to top tier that I think has always kind of been missing compared to lower BRs. The Typhoon is basically Russia's JLTV, which we covered in part 1, used by their airborne forces or VDV, and here we're looking at the K4386 variant with the same turret as the Lazar 3. Now I said in the last video how the armoured car from April Fools this year was basically what the JLTV RS6 would be like in game, given that its missiles functioned like javelins, but the turret itself was a dead ringer for this system, called Spitzer. It doesn't have ATGMs though, and only the one gun. Just given the performance of these armoured cars, again think Type 93 mobility with some actual MG protection, and the fact that the gun would be much more useful than the M230 gun on the JLTV, with the BMP-2M's APFSDS, the Typhoon K could be 9.7 or higher. You might say it'd seem a wee bit useless there with the gun alone, especially when the Bumerang and BTR-90 exist, but if it gets added after a lot of these wheeled IFVs we brought up in a new meta, it'd have a ton of similar vehicles it could very easily kill. And a small, nimble platform like this that can still go very fast off-road would be perfect for that. And that's kind of the trend we've been seeing in War Thunder. I remember even when the Big Light Panzer was added in 1.71 and it was the first IFV, everyone said it was a bit useless, since there were no other light vehicles at top tier for it to kill with its gun besides Sheridans. Everyone else was in heavy tanks or MBTs back then. Then we started getting more and more IFVs like the BMP-2, the Warrior, Bradley, which could all obviously gun down each other, and they introduced a bit of a new meta. Some wheeled tank destroyers and light ATGM carriers later, and now even these autocannon only vehicles still seem pretty good. On the same track as the last vehicle is the BPM-97 Vistral, which is almost the same thing as the Typhoon K, just weirder looking, and could make for a good event vehicle at the same BR. The third 4x4 and the last Russian vehicle on this list is the Kornet D, which entered service in 2015. And this one's based on the Tigra armoured car, which is basically the Typhoon's predecessor. Equipped with 2 quad launchers of Kornet ATGMs and capable of a top speed of 140 km per hour, the Kornet D would be a ridiculous vehicle to play. Now obviously Kornets are inferior to Javelins and Spikes, but you've got 8 ready to fire with this vehicle and 8 reloads as well, plus an electro-optical target locking system. Now if that functionality were modelled in game, the Kornet D could also be a great anti-helicopter platform and would be very good at taking out other super fast vehicles like the JLTV. Because of that, the Kornet D would be a 10.3 vehicle in my opinion. Well, that was 3 pages of my script for Russia alone. I'm pretty sure by this point in the last video we were up to our 5th nation. Yeah, I said Russia had a lot of these things. Now we can move on to China, but before talking about China itself, I wanted to take this opportunity to go over a couple of branch nations that I think could be added to China the way South Africa was for Britain, or Finland for Sweden. Vietnam and North Korea have their closest geopolitical and military relationships with China, and both are already represented with vehicles in the Chinese tree, but I think they should be formally added to the nation the way South Africa was. Vietnam have a variant of the BTR-152 that could make for a great low-tier SPAA, and North Korea have a few more interesting vehicles China could get, provided Gaijin can get information on them. I hear it's quite difficult. One of the main reasons I wanted to suggest these is for the sake of China's helicopter tree, which could start out with a couple of Vietnamese models like the Mi-4 or Mi-24A, neither of which China used. There's also the North Korean MD-500E, which carries, I believe, HJ-73 missiles. But for the purposes of this video, what we're concerned about is the BRDM-2 based ATGM carriers. Both of these countries used the BRDM-2, but I'm not sure if either used specifically the ATGM platform variants we brought up for Russia. What I do know is that North Korea developed their own version of the Malyutka vehicle based on the Russian one, using BRDMs they had. This is a little different to the Russian variant, both in looks and in armament however, so it's not a copy-paste. The M1992, as it's called, uses an upgraded variant of the Malyutka missile with SAC-close guidance, meaning it'll be mouse-aimed in War Thunder, but as a trade-off, this vehicle only has a single missile ready to fire, and I'm not sure how many reloads. With that in mind, I think it could still sit at the same battle rating of 7.3. Of course, if North Korea, or more likely Vietnam, used the 9P122 variant of the BRDM-2 itself, that makes things a lot easier. The 9P148 as well. But it would be copy-paste, which I know a lot of people have problems with. Moving on to actual Chinese equipment, we start out with the ZSL-92. This is the most similar vehicle to the Type 87 RCV out of all of these, and it's built on the same 6-wheel chassis that the PTL-02 uses, but with a 25mm cannon and an unmanned turret. The cannon has a fire rate of 200 rounds per minute and uses APDS rounds, which would give it a bit less penetration than the Type 87, about on par with the LAV-25. Unfortunately, that gun doesn't have a stabilizer, and I don't believe it had a thermal sight either, so I'd suggest a battle rating of 8.0. The gun isn't very powerful, as it's basically a scaled up version of the Soviet 23mm anti-aircraft gun, rather than something like the Bushmaster cannon, and the vehicle has a slightly lower top speed of 90 km per hour. The ZSL-92B is an upgraded version of that vehicle with the same 30mm gun the BTR-80 has, as well as HJ-73C ATGMs. This would basically be China's BTR-90, but I don't believe this variant got thermals either. I'm not sure. I've said that having thermal optics wouldn't make too much difference for autocannon only vehicles like the LAV-25 or BTR-80A versus 82A, since they have to engage at relatively close ranges anyway, which is why the BTR-82A can sit just a single BR above its predecessor and be fairly balanced. When it comes to using the ATGM, however, something you'll be using from longer ranges, lacking a thermal optic can make a big difference, so the ZSL-92B would be okay at 8.7. Possibly 9.0. Really all these battle ratings are relative to each other, so it's a bit difficult to suggest accurately for so many vehicles when we've only got a couple of examples in-game already to go off of. If I had my way, we'd get some damn decompression, and then things would be a lot easier. A good event, squadron, or battle pass vehicle would be the Export VN2C, equipped with the 30mm cannon and an unmanned turret, and built on a modernised version of the same 6-wheel chassis. Again, I'm only going by what I can find, and I don't believe even this vehicle has thermal optics. As such, this fits well alongside the BTR-80A at 8.3, or if it does turn out to have thermals, then 8.7. It was first unveiled in 2016 and acquired by the country of Mali in 2021, and anything that represents new nations in game is good in my books, as personally, I like collecting those vehicles. I need to do a video on that collection of mine. Next is the ZBL-08, which is much easier to talk about as it is basically just the Chinese equivalent to the ICVD or Boxer Lance we brought up in the last video, or equivalent to the BTR-90, depending on configuration. I'll explain. In its standard form, the ZBL-08, which entered production in 2008 and service in 2009, is just equipped with the same 30mm gun from the BTR-80s and the ZSL-92B. It has a stabilizer, as well as both a gunner and commander thermal sight, so in this configuration it fits perfectly at either 8.7 or 9.0, depending on whether or not it has APFSDS rounds. I don't believe it could use the APFSDS the BTR-90 and BMP-2M have, and I couldn't find any information on any domestically developed ones, but it's certainly possible. If it's just using the APDS, then it fits well alongside the BTR-82A, having a CITV instead of an unmanned turret. The other option is to add it with twin rails for HJ73C ATGMs, but I'm not sure how many reloads it could hold in that configuration. This would be slightly worse than the BTR-90, so it could fit in at 9.0 or 9.3 if it has APFSDS. It's really up to Gaijin with which configuration they decide to go with. Personally, I think the ATGM variant would be better since you'd be upgrading from the ZSL-92B, at least provided it carries a decent number of those missiles. If it barely carries enough to matter though, say 2 or 4 max, then add it in the base form at a lower BR. Again built on the WZ551 chassis used by the PTL-02, ZSL-92 and VN2C, is the QSL-92. Man, creativity is not Norinco's strong suit, is it? Built on the 4-wheeled version of the chassis in 1999, the QSL-92, also known as the AFT-9, is basically China's version of the new French Mephisto. The QSL, however, uses the laser-guided HJ-9 ATGMs with a tandem warhead. These missiles are larger than the HOTs used by the Mephisto and have around 1100 to 1200mm penetration. The QSL also has a much more powerful engine than the Mephisto, while weighing about the same amount. It does have thermals for the gunner, though I'm not sure about the commander. I said in the last video that I think the Mephisto should be raised to 8.7, since when used correctly, it's far too good to be fighting 7.3 down tiers. As a side note, vehicles like this often get a bad rap from content creators specifically trying to review them, because they queue up in that specific vehicle and only try to play it to get footage, when the vehicle is meant to support an existing lineup and doesn't suit all maps and situations. When they happen to get maps that don't suit it and play it anyway because they're trying to make a video, they rate it relatively poorly, but that can be pretty inaccurate. On the right maps where you'd actually elect to play it naturally, a lot of these more niche support vehicles end up feeling pretty OP, and the Mephisto is definitely one of them. It's about recognizing when to play it and when not to, but obviously YouTubers trying to make a video on it as quickly as possible are playing it regardless of what map they get. So if the Mephisto goes up to 8.7, which it definitely should, then the QSL can fit in at 9.0. One of the most exciting factors of vehicles like this is that most nations get some fairly unique ones, since even countries that use a lot of foreign tech can typically develop their own armoured cars, and China is no exception. The Dongfeng Mingxi is exactly that, and the variant we're looking at first is China's equivalent to the Typhoon K, equipped with a 30mm remote turret. The Mingxi is a broad designation for a whole family of 4x4 armoured cars, with initial variants being basically copies of the Humvee, but this one is based on the heavier CSK 181. It has a top speed of 130 km/h, and like the JLTV and Typhoon, is completely protected against 7.62mm machine guns. The remote turret has a thermal optic, and what appears to be a new 30mm autocannon rather than the old ZPT-99, which probably means the potential for APFSDS rounds. The vehicle was only first seen in 2021, and not a lot is known about it, which could prevent it coming to the game for a while. Like the Typhoon K, I'll suggest a BR of 9.7 or 9.3 if it lacks APFSDS, but I can't see that being the case. The job of this kind of vehicle is mostly to kill other wheeled IFVs anyway though, so not having APFSDS wouldn't be a huge drawback. The second variant and the last vehicle on this list is the TL-4, unveiled in 2018, using the lighter CSK 131 variant of the Mingshi armoured car, which isn't as protected. The vehicle is a platform for the TL-4 ATGM, which is basically China's Javelin. Like the Javelin, it's a fire-and-forget top-attack ATGM with a tandem warhead and around 1100mm penetration, and like the Javelin, it's exceptionally easy to use. Hell, the PLA even put one on a quad bike. To put that into perspective, that's a vehicle smaller than the L333 and less than half the weight, with the ability to one-hit kill an Abrams from 6 kilometers away. We did it! We found a vehicle even more ridiculous than the Lamborghini. On the Mingshi, the TL-4 missiles are arranged in 4 tubes, with the vehicle carrying up to 4 reloads. Because of that, I'll suggest the same battle rating as the JLTV RS6 from the last video, that being 10.7. It loses the 30mm chain gun, but gains that all-important multi-shot capability. Now, as I said in the last video, I personally find these kinds of vehicles really enjoyable, specifically because they have a more niche playstyle, focusing on support, without feeling powerless or ineffective. If you've not played the Type 93, I highly recommend it, and to put it into perspective, most of these armoured cars are even faster. Well guys, last week we covered around 28 vehicles for 8 different NATO and Western nations. Today, we've managed 20 for just the remaining 2. Just goes to show you how many of these types of vehicles could come to the game. Guys, like I said last time, I know some of you do have problems with these super fast vehicles, and while I certainly think Gaijin aren't the best at balancing them, I still enjoy them and enjoy talking about them. And that you might have problems with things like fire and forget top attack ATGMs, your Javelins, Spikes and TL-4s coming to the game. Now I do think that these will come to the game before long regardless, even though unfortunately Russia don't have any real equivalent, and provided they're line of sight only, no post-launch lock-on, and they have a locking time before they can be fired at a target, they should be perfectly fine. You're still better off just shooting a 120 or 125mm round, especially in short to medium range engagements. In fact, these missiles struggle to function at all in close quarters. The good thing about these vehicle types, however, is that let's say Gaijin gives us some more long-range maps with some good roads. Please give us some highways on Red Desert, Gaijin. These things can get around them super easily, meaning there isn't so much downtime between spawns. And with these types of ATGM systems, they'll be great for taking out each other, while leading for a little armoured car going 100 km per hour 2 kilometers away with a conventional cannon can be kind of difficult. That being said, just as I said last time, I don't expect all of these vehicles to come to the game. Certainly not anytime soon. It's just a fun list of potential options. We're often saying these days how Russia have such a crazy number of top tier vehicles to choose from that they can be tough to beat, so giving them a dozen more probably isn't the best idea right now. Anyway, I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. Once again, if you didn't catch part 1, there are links down below, along with a like and subscribe button, which you should click on. I apologise for the delay. I had to do an emergency rebuild of my computer due to some issues, but for now I'm just going to say thank you so much for watching. Let me know which one of these vehicles was your favourite, or that you want to see the most, and I'll catch you on the battlefield. But around the end of 2021, various Russian tanks, predominantly the T-72B and B3, started to be spotted with these big rooftop cages sitting above the turret, and initial reports supposed that these were a measure to defeat top attack ATGMs. Now, if you're not familiar with the concept of a top attack missile, you've almost certainly heard of them, with Ukraine fielding a bunch of them against the invading Russian army, consisting particularly of the Swedish In-Law and the American Javelin.